emphasize the word you within this passage. So he starts, and whenever you have this, a lot of times you can circle them and makes it a little bit easy. But chapter 13 and verse 1, Job says, "Behold, my eyes have seen all of this, my ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you." Okay? I'm not inferior to you. Well, that is Zophar's persona that he's putting out there by the speech that he gave. He says in verse 3, "But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue with God. But you smear with lies. You are all worthless physicians. Oh, that you would be completely silent, and that it would become your wisdom. Please hear my argument and listen to the contentions of my lips. Will you speak what is unjust for God and speak what is deceitful for him? Will you show partiality for him? Will you contend for God? Will it be well when he examines you? Or will you deceive him as one deceives a man? He will surely reprove you if you secretly show partiality. Will not his majesty terrify you, and the dread of him fall on you? Your memorable sayings are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay." And so in verse 1, it's not sufficient just to talk about God from Job's perspective within his argument. Anybody can do that. Anybody can say anything they want about God. Whether it's true or not is a whole different story. Job wants, he wants them to understand that there are new possibilities outside of their current doctrine. What is their current doctrine? Doctrine of retribution, where the God always punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. That's right. So he's trying to persuade them out. There's more to all of this than what you currently think there is. And so verse 2 indicates that Job has gone through, he's already gone through a listing of all of these things here. He's demonstrating to his friends that he's fully aware of the supremacy of God. Job understands how supreme God is, and therefore he appreciates God and understands that God has a right to act in any way that he sees fit. He believes in that to his core, but his problem is it doesn't answer the question, right? What is the main question that we come to, or that we ask when we come to Job? Why do what? Why do good suffer, right? That is the question that we all have, and that is a question that has not been answered for Job. And so verse 3, Job says, "I'm wasting my time with you." Okay? I want to talk to God. I don't want to talk to you anymore. I want to talk to God. You keep talking about God. You keep telling me what God thinks and what God does and what God wants to do. Meanwhile, you don't have a clue. So I'm done talking to you. I want to talk to God. And so we get down to verse 14. He starts talking about the fact that they're lying about Job by insisting over and over again, demanding that he has sinned. And they have not, and this is important, they've told him he has sinned, but have prescribed him nothing to get rid of it. What is the one thing that we tend to be really good at? Judging or telling people this is what is wrong. This is what you've done. And then we leave the room and we feel good about ourselves because we've pointed out the problem in their life, but we have given them nothing to overcome. Okay? Jesus came to seek and save that which was lost. So he came to identify sin, but then to offer a way out of sin. Okay? Romans chapter 5, verse 9 and 10 is a good place to think about that. Verse 5, he says, you have told me to stop talking so much, and they have done that plenty. And Job essentially says, I feel the same about you. You're doing the same thing. Just keep your arguments to yourself. Proverbs 17:28 kind of says the same thing. So verse 6, all Job wants is for his friends to give some serious consideration to what he's saying. All right? And sometimes I think that's how we feel if we're in a bind some way, we're in a bad spot, whatever, you're being accused of something, or you've fallen into the same group as someone, or whatever. Things are bad are going on, and nobody's giving you any consideration. Okay? Consider the things that I have to say. All right? Well, that's what Job is wanting. So verse 7, beginning here, Job is going to accuse his friends of committing 4 terrible sins. All right? 4 terrible sins. And here is what they are. In verse number 7, number 1, they are presuming the way that God feels. Okay? They're telling another person, this is how God feels about you. Verse 7. Somebody read verse 7.
Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him?
Okay. Number 2, they are attempting to speak for God. Okay? So they want to tell people how God feels, and they want to tell others or speak on behalf of God. Let me ask you this. Does God need anybody to speak on his behalf? No. He doesn't need anybody to speak on his behalf. Number 3, they presume to speak for God's partiality. God's partiality. Is God partial? No. God doesn't show any partiality, does he? Romans chapter 2, verse 11. Somebody read that for us. Romans 2, verse 11. What does that say? Yep. No respecter of persons. That means God shows no partiality, right? What does Acts 10:34 say? Acts 10:34. What is it? No partiality. We're going to find that throughout Paul's letters pretty often. That God is not one who shows partiality. Somebody define, what does partiality mean? And maybe yours actually defined it and how it said it. What did yours say in Romans 2? Respecter of persons. So what does that mean? Right, you're favoring one over the other. Now, some people will look at the text without ever acknowledging or reading or studying anything and say that who would be the favorite people of the New Testament? Okay, we have Pharisees, would you say? Israel, okay. I would say probably, we'll just say the Jews to cover all of that, right? And why would you say that? Okay. They were the first people that God chose. Okay. I like how she said that. They got first dibs. That's great. They had first dibs on it. Okay. So everybody, when we look back at the Old Testament, Israel, Israel was who? Okay, but who specifically? Huh? It would be the seed of Abraham, but who specifically? Jacob. Jacob is Israel. And then Jacob had how many sons? 12, and they became what? 12 tribes, which is the nation of Israel, okay? So when we talk about Israel, of the Old Testament, we're talking about all the sons of Jacob, all right, which are fulfillment of the seed, or the promise of seed, the seed promise from Abram that we read about in Genesis 12 and Genesis 17, okay? So we have that, all right? So God, He has these people. He leads them out of Egypt. He takes care of them, blah, 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 blah. Is God always happy with them? No, because they're, well, Moses said it best in Deuteronomy 31, they're rebellious people. They're hard-headed. They don't listen. They complain about everything. Boy, how lucky were they to get first dibs, right? Did God only care about Israel? No, He didn't. So when we look at our Old Testaments, we can even see that God did not, He wasn't partial to the nation of Israel. Why did He choose, or what did He choose the nation of Israel for? That's who Jesus, the line of Jesus, was going to come through. Specifically, through who? What line? Judah, right? Well, that's right. David, Judah. So that's how we got him here, okay? Well, that's the purpose of which they were chosen, all right? They were His chosen people. He loved them, all that stuff, and there's a lot of reason behind that, but that is a specific reason of why He chose them. But we have many other instances where God is also looking after people who are not of Israel, who are not Hebrew. Did God not give opportunity to Egypt? He did, right? 10 different times. Well, more than that, but, right? He gave them a lot of different times. Did God not look out for Assyria? Yeah, He did. And Assyria was horrible. They were way worse than everybody else. Did God not look out for Babylon? Yeah, okay. God has looked out for everybody. And there are different laws and things that, each were under and all that stuff. That's a huge study. But then we get to a place like Romans, and Romans tells us that there's no partiality with God. Romans chapter 1 is not to the Jews. Who's it written to? To the Gentiles. Chapter 2 is written to the Jews. And Paul in Ephesians wants to bring the two together to make one new man. All right? So the friends here are, basically saying that God is partial, and this is something that is absolutely not true. That's in verse 8. Somebody read verse 8, by the way. Job 13:8.
Will you show partiality for Him? Will you contend for God?
Okay. So the next part is the actual contending, which is essentially this. Are you going to take on God's battles? Do the people fight for God, or does God fight for the people? Okay, so these are 4 sinful things that they are, saying. And so this is actually going back to chapter 11, verse 7 and 8 with Zophar in his argument. As Zophar was wishing for God to speak, so he goes on to say that God would have said anyway, Job, you better be careful about what you're doing, especially when you speak unjust. And the friends are continuing to go on and say that you've sinned and you are unjust before God, so on and so forth. So, those are the things that are going on there. Then we get to verse 8, and again, we find that word you. Did anybody circle or underline all the words you or your? Anybody do that? Go through and count. How many times down through verse 12 we find you or your in your version? I don't have it done in my Bible, so whatever you tell me, I'll believe you. Through 12. Yeah, just go down to 12. $19? What version's that? ESV's got 19. Means the New American Standard is probably pretty close to that. Anybody have anything different? 19? 19 times. You know what that means? Is that you is a key word, right? There you go. So he is really throwing it back at him, all right? So in verse 9, Job suddenly becomes aware that the friend's theology is a dangerous theology. Okay? It's very dangerous, and it's something that is placing their souls in jeopardy because all of these have to do with that. Okay? They're explaining, here's how God feels about you. And I'm going to speak to you for God. God is not partial to you anymore. Because, I mean, that's what this is a doctrine of partiality. I mean, really. And, of course, taking on God's battles, which is essentially how they feel or what they feel that they need to be doing. So in verse 10, the friends are being are guilty of being partial for God, and Job believes that this is worthy of receiving God's reproof. All right? Go down to verse 13. Actually, let's go down to verse 15, where he says, until my last breath, or you have some version of that, my hope will be in God. Again, we're looking at that idea of seeing God as supreme. He doesn't intend to give up. He still has hope in God. He still trusts in God. He doesn't understand a lot of things, but that's how he's feeling. Verse 16, Job believes that he will come before God ultimately. He will come in his presence sooner or later. He doesn't know when that's going to be. He doesn't know how that's going to happen. He's very frustrated, but he does believe it's going to happen. And so in verse 17, he appeals to him again, listen carefully to my speech and let my declaration fill your ears. And so he challenges them to think about his argument in verse 18, because he is going to be vindicated in the end. And he really believes that, which he will be when we get to chapter 42. So if someone would give Job an answer which would prove him wrong, at that point it's almost as if he would essentially have peace, and he would just be still, be quiet, and die. And he would die in peace, understanding where and what he is going through. So then that brings us to 20, and it says, only two things do not do to me, then I will not hide from your face. Then in verse 21, remove your hand from me, and let not the dread of you terrify me. So two things he asks of God: do not remove your hand from me, and second, which is more external care and protection from God, do not let the dread, or how to say in this one, let not the dread of you terrify me. Okay. Then in verse 22, once those things have happened, Job believes that they can talk. I'm kind of going through this so that we can cover a little bit more ground here, because again, a lot of this is going to be repetitive. Verse 26, Job is recognizing. Now here, mark verse 26. We know that Job is a man who did not sin. We know that Job was very diligent in chapter 1 to make sure that he and his family were righteous. And so we understand Job is righteous. But verse 26 gives us a different perspective. He says, for you write bitter things against me and make me to inherit the iniquities of my youth. What does the word iniquity mean? Sin. So here we find out Job did sin, but it was earlier in life. And he believes, rightfully so, that God had forgiven him of whatever sin that he had committed. And so by the acting priest of his family, He continually offered sacrifices on behalf of himself. He lived a righteous life. He was offering sacrifices on behalf of his children so that they could be righteous. And so he believes that he has been forgiven. But, again, he's reaching for straws here. So verse 27, Job feels for some unknown reason that God is watching him like a jailer would watch some type of dangerous prisoner. And now he is very limited on what he can do and where he can go. Well, that takes us to chapter 14, which we're not going to cover very much of this. Again, very repetitive. But Job is, expressing his wish to die. Has done this numerous times. And he is not providing any excuses for anything that he has done. In verse 3, Job knows God is still watching all that's going on in his life. Verse 5, Job recognizes all this within the power of God, that God is determining the length of a man's life, which might explain why Job had, of course, not died yet. In verse 7 through 12, Job considers that the fate of the inanimate things is better than the fate of humans. And then he breaks down and gives some more illustrations with a tree in verse 7 through 10 and with a lake in verse 11. Let's see here. He talks about Sheol in verse 13, and we're going to make our way through this because of how repetitive some of this stuff is. So I would encourage you to read through chapter 14. So that takes us over to chapter 16. Chapter 16 is a response to Eliphaz. This would be speech number 8, but Job's fourth speech. Eliphaz has just stated that Job must not be as righteous as he claims to be. And so Job, meanwhile, is going to remain steadfast with two main points. I am what? What is Job? Righteous. I am righteous. That's number one. And number two, God, as God, can do as he pleases. Okay? Those are two foundational things that we understand here. So when we read in verses 1 through 5, it says, Then Job answered, I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. Is there no limit to windy words, or what plagues you that you answer? I too speak like you. If I were in your place, I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips could lessen your pain. So Job again lets the friends know how terribly disappointed that he is with each one of them. They were sorry comforters in verse 4. He talks about them, shaking their head at him. Job's way of saying, if I were in your place, I would not do what you are doing to me. I could, but I wouldn't. All right? Then in verse 6 through 8, Job recognizes that he is under, again, the power of God, and it is God who has struck him down, and that's what's so difficult for Job to understand, because he believes he's being treated as an enemy would be treated, which again seems to go back to this, because God only punishes the wicked, right? So he's going back to that idea. Now in verse 9 through 14, Job describes God's treatment of him with several metaphors. Okay, look at verse 9. Verse 9, he talks about the wild beast. All right? In the second part of verse 9 through verse 10, he discusses the adversary. In verse 11, he talks about a traitor. In verse 12, the beginning of verse 12, he talks about a wrestler. In 12b, through the first part of chapter 13, he talks about the archer. And then in verse 6, 13 and 14, he talks about the warrior. And so he gives those different metaphors about God's treatment of him and maintains that God's actions are like, okay, the beast, the adversary, the traitor, the wrestler, the archer, and the warrior. And so verse 16 and 17, Job says that there's no violence in his hands, and that his prayer is pure. Again, he is maintaining his innocence. And then in 18 through 22, Job repeats the argument that he has already given. Now, chapter 17, again, is a section that seems to repeat another one of Job's main arguments. I want to die, all right? In verse 11 through 16, he concludes his speech talking about his depths of despair. I told you we were moving through that pretty fast because it really is repetitive. Now, chapter 19 is what we have 5 minutes to try and get through a little bit of this, okay? In verse 1 through 6, chapter 19, that Job responded. Again, he's responding to Bildad in chapter 18. How long will you torment me and crush me with words? These 10 times you have insulted me. You are not ashamed to wrong me, even if I have truly erred. My error lodges within me. If indeed you vaunt yourself against me and prove my disgrace to me, know then that God has wronged me and has closed his net around me. All right? So 1 through 6 holds a lot of things. He really believes, and he lets his friends know how very hurtful their words have been. Okay? We have to be really careful about what we say when people are hurting. You can intentionally or unintentionally really hurt somebody. And in this case, I think in some ways it is unintentional, especially in the beginning, but as time goes by, they're pretty intentional about what they're saying, okay? Now, verse 7 through 12, Job repeats one of his 5 main arguments. I want to talk to God. Again, I'm done talking to you guys. I want to talk to God. And, he's definitely rock bottom is where Job is. And then in verse 13 through 22, Job repeats another of his 5 arguments. You, friends, are not helping me. And this is where we run into one of the saddest sections of Job's speech, because it seems that this gives us a little bit more detail. So if we start reading in verse 13 down through verse 19, look at what he says. He goes on to say, he has removed my brothers far from me, and my acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My relatives have failed, and my intimate friends have forgotten me. Those who live in my house and my maids consider me a stranger. I am a foreigner in their sight. I call to my servant, but he does not answer. I have to implore him with my mouth. My breath is offensive to my wife, and I am loathsome to my own brothers. He goes on to say, even young children despise me. I rise up and they speak against me. All my associates abhor me or hate me, and those I love have turned against me. So, number 1, in verse 13 and 14, as a result of his situation, his brothers and his relatives no longer have anything to do with him. In 15 and 16, his household servants are ignoring him. In verse 17, his relationship with his wife and with his brother is completely strained. In verse 18, children don't like him anymore. In verse 19, the other acquaintances that he have become his enemies. Now, this is a guy that truly is rock bottom. And then in verse 20, it tells us, my bone clings to my skin and my flesh, and I have escaped only the skin of my teeth. What do you think that means? My bone clings to my skin and my flesh. What's another way we could put that? Nothing but skin and bones. You see how we've got some time that we have covered here, right? Some time that we've covered. This was a very rich man who had a lot livestock. He had all the food that he wanted. I don't know how big or small he was, but he's gone through it. And so in verse 20 and 21, Job appeals for compassion because of, his situation is just downright pitiful. It's really horrible. In verse 23, really beginning with this verse, we have one of the most famous sections of Job. Job here wishes for a book to record of his plight so that the future generations might have a witness of his innocence. And Job got his wish, as there is a book that definitely discusses him and who he is. In verse 26, we get into a few difficult passages with some translation here about what's being expressed here. One possibility is he's expressing a confidence in the afterlife, believing that he will see God in his flesh when he's gone, or after his flesh is gone. Or it could be that Job's expressing a confidence that while still in the flesh, he shall see God. So it's kind of hard to know, but contextually, either way, he's saying he's going to see God. Then in verse 27, Job clearly believes that he will have the benefit of seeing God. He just doesn't know when. And then in 28 and 29, the friends have been, in essence, a self-appointed judge, jury, and executioner because they have taken part of these things right here. And so that will work us into where we're trying to get here. Got that. We'll work on 21 next time. We're trying to make our way to 28, and so we moved and covered a lot of ground. So before they come in, are there any questions or comments? Clarification about anything? I'm good.